City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, playwright, director, choreographer.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminar, brought to you here at the City University of New York. I'm Jim Houghton. I'm the Artistic Director of Signature Theater Company. It's my great pleasure to serve as moderator today for our discussion about playwrights and new plays. On our panel today is a distinguished group of writers with diverse experiences and visions in the theater, who share in common having new plays and new works presented in New York this season. To my far right, sitting is playwright, screenwriter, and novelist Paul Rudnick, the author of Jeffrey and I Hate Hamlet. His play Valhalla is receiving its premiere at New York Theater Workshop, and his newest film, The Stepford Wives, debuts this summer. His articles and essays have appeared in Vogue, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Premiere, and the New York Times. Next to him is Julia Jordan, who's seen 4 of her plays produced in New York this year: Saint Scarlet, Summer of the Swans, Tatiana in Color, and Boy. She has also written the musicals The Mice, presented as part of Harold Prince's 3, and Sarah Plain and Tall. Her work has been commissioned and workshopped by many organizations and theaters across the country. Her plays have been published by Smith & Krause and by Vintage. Nilo Cruz sits to my immediate right, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Anna in the Tropics. His other plays, seen across the country, include Lorca in the Green Dress, Two Sisters and a Piano, and Dancing on Her Knees. His newest play, Beauty of the Father, just premiered at Miami's New Theater. He is one of this country's most produced Cuban-American writers. Regina Taylor, on my left, is actress and a playwright. Her play, Drowning Crow, her adaptation of Chekhov's The Seagull, is soon to open in Manhattan Theater Club. Her play, Crowns, seen in New York last season, is receiving productions across the country. Her current projects include a musical adaptation of Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, and The Dreams of Sarah Breedlove, a look at legendary beauty entrepreneur, Madam C.J. Walker. And finally, we have Terrence McNally, the recipient of 4 Tony Awards. His long list of works, both plays and musicals, include Ragtime, Masterclass, The Lisbon Traviata, Love, Valor, Compassion, and Kiss of the Spider-Woman, as well as the libretto for the opera Dead Man Walking. He has received a citation from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His newest work, The Stendhal Syndrome, is premiering at Primary Stages. Well, first of all, welcome to all of you, and thanks for participating today in our discussion. It's my hope that today that we might have the opportunity to illuminate some of the challenges and issues that confront the American playwright. And through that discussion, help all of us identify, through your various experiences, how we might all come to a better understanding of our role, whether that's as an audience member, as an artist, or as a writer, in the process of creating new work and watching new work evolve. So I guess I'd like to just start by running down the panel and having each of you talk a bit about what the evolution of the current project you're working on has been, from sort of the incubator to its current production. So why don't we start with you, Terrence?
Talk about the current play,
Yes.
Stendhal Syndrome. Well, Stendhal Syndrome is a little different in that it's 2 related one-act plays, which I want to be performed together, but I suppose they would make sense if they were done apart. They're unusual in that they haven't been workshopped to death. I wrote them. One is quite old. The second act, Prelude and Liebestod, I wrote 9 years ago. And I knew I liked it, but I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it in a drawer. And then I, 2 years ago, got an idea of a play that would go with it, and called the evening The Stendhal Syndrome. And it was given to Primary Stages, and they said, we'd love to do it, which was breathtaking because I'm sure you'll hear from the others. Usually that's very interesting script you've sent us. Let's do a reading, or our dramaturg has some notes for you. And it was kind of like the old days when I started in the 60s. You wrote a play and it got produced. And it's changed. So this is not a typical experience to have the play just done, especially in New York without prior. I'm obviously the oldest person on the panel, and the theater has changed a lot since I began to today, so my experiences are going to be quite different from the other panelists. But there's nothing wrong with workshop and development, but I think very often they become an excuse not to do the play. If I was a dramaturg, and I'm very glad I'm not, I consider them really the enemy, and I'm very hostile to them, and I wonder why I'm so hostile. When they say, this is our dramaturg, the hairs on my neck stand up, and I haven't never found one I thought was remotely charming. I think they're sort of beady-eyed, and they don't even try to ingratiate themselves. They just say, I've got some notes for you. You know, and that's, no playwright wants to hear that, like, hello, how are you? I love your play. You don't usually get that. But if I were a dramaturg, I would find a lot wrong with Hamlet, which is probably my favorite play. But, you know, what happens to Gertrude once Hamlet tells, you know, it's very unwritten how an actress would play the last 45 minutes of Hamlet. A lot of questions in that play. And I think plays have to have a life to them. And I think dramaturgs, it's what happens in American culture. I think, you know, we have big books, you know, Barnes and Nobles is chasing the little guy out of business. Plays with dramaturgs get sort of homogenized, I feel. And I go to the theater to hear the unique voice of a writer, not what someone has fashioned it into. And they were not around when I started writing plays. Everybody had their own voice. A play by Lanford Wilson was nothing like a play by Edward Albee. And now there's sometimes I feel people are getting a little more homogenized. And dramaturgs have too much to say, and I think plays can be rewritten too much. And I learn a lot from readings. When I finish a play, I give it to my actor friends and say, come on over, I'll give you coffee and Danish, and just hear it. But that's not the same as endless readings and development. And I think with so many people, their input, how the play should turn out, can sort of flatten it out. I like the bumps and warts in a play that, you know, maybe they're not perfect, but hey, that's only something Nilo Cruz would write, you know, and I like that. And so that's what I think is the biggest change. Plays take years to get on, and musicals even more, and they've sort of been too many people have had at them. And I'll shut up now.
No, I look forward to exploring. You've definitely hit upon a very sensitive subject that I'm sure everyone on this panel has something to say about, which I'd like to table that till we finish going through the panel. Regina, how about you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about Drowning Crow? And that was commissioned, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was commissioned by the Goodman Theater. It was first done at the Goodman Theater a couple of years ago. And it is an adaptation of Chekhov's The Seagull. It's one of my favorite plays, and I wanted to explore what that was about. Why does it have such resonance for me? In doing that, I started having a conversation with Anton, and it was, you know, what does he have to say to me? This Russian guy living so many years ago, what does he have to say to me, a black woman from Dallas, Texas? In that, it was really wonderful, just the universal themes of I'm in love with somebody who doesn't want me, you know, unrequited love. Everyone's in love with someone who won't reciprocate. It's also about finding one's voice, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, wanting to be recognized by someone special and then in the larger audience, as an artist and as a human being. And then discovering parts of Chekhov, which was that his background is that of serfs. His people were serfs, slaves. And that really gives his perspective on the world and through his writing. It is a very harsh caste system in his time. and it's a stigma throughout his whole life. You have a generation that remembers serfdom in this play. It's also a generational play. You have a generation that remembers serfdom, slavery. You have a generation that fought really hard for social change to become upwardly mobile. And then you had a generation after that that's not so tied to its roots, has forgotten its roots, and is kind of looking for a moral compass. And you don't know if this generation is going to implode or explode. Is what he's writing about. And I was going, okay, I can relate to that. I truly can relate to that. Setting it then present day on a Gullah island, all black folk, makes sense in that. The parallel universe is very strong here. And what I'm doing with the play is the same thing that Chekhov did. Chekhov sampled Hamlet a lot, someone outside of his culture. And what I'm doing is sampling Chekhov and Hamlet and a lot of other sources, mixes, the same way that artists throughout the centuries have sampled each other, whether that's Picasso and Matisse, whether that's with a jazz musician who takes a standard and riffs on the melody, is what we're doing here.
Can you talk about what the evolution of the actual production has been? When was the first production, or how did you get to that first production, and how is it that it's arrived here at Manhattan Theater Club?
It was first done at the Goodman Theater a couple of years ago. I'm an associate artist with them and do projects with them every year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And I presented this as a possibility, as something I'd like to explore. Mm-hmm. So we did it there, and 2 years later, it's now on Broadway.
That's great. Let's go to you, Paul. Talk a little bit about Valhalla and what your experiences have been in terms of it coming to New York.
Right. Well, I did have an earlier workshop, but it was in New York, and which I was very grateful for. About 2 years ago, we did a production at Juilliard, which, thanks to Michael Kahn there, he allowed us to use actors from the fourth-year acting class, and we had 6 weeks of rehearsal and a full production with sets, costumes, lights, and even more importantly, almost an audience. We were given about 14 performances, so it was protected from critics and that kind of outside eye, but it was a full production experience, which was invaluable. Because Valhalla is has a complicated structure. It combines a story of Mad Ludwig of Bavaria, an actual king from the 1800s, with a fictional tale of a kid from Texas in the 1930s. And these stories eventually intertwine, and that's what I wanted to appear as graceful as possible. And that's why that earlier production was very, very helpful. And in fact, one of the actresses, a wonderful woman named Samantha Soul, who had been at Juilliard, is now in the current production because she graduated and she's been working nonstop, and we were lucky to be able to get her back. So after that Juilliard production, we did do then a kind of 2-week workshop at the New York Theater Workshop, which was also very helpful. I think there is, as Terrence was saying, there is an enormous amount of protocol in the theater today in which everyone kind of needs to feel very included in the process, which can be, very helpful, and I understand that emotional need, but it can make for a long haul. But I worked at the workshop before, so I felt very welcome there. I'd done a play called The Most Fabulous Story. So now that Valhalla is actually up and running, it's been an absolutely terrific experience. I've worked with Chris Ashley, who's the director I've had on my past 5 plays. So there's a real sense of old home week there. And I guess one thing that I realized, right before Valhalla went into rehearsal for its real production, I had just come off a big movie, off The Stepford Wives, which is a big Hollywood production with big stars and tons of money, and it was very exciting. But I have never been so grateful to get back into a small room with 6 actors and 1 director, because you just feel so much more control on the most basic level, and that you could get your hands dirty in a way that a movie is such an enormous undertaking, and there's so much financial risk involved, and there are studios, and there's everyone, and it's all quite understandable when you're dealing with that kind of money and those kind of names. but it's the writer can get very kind of buried and very frantic in those situations. Actually, I was lucky. I was, even on the film, I was working with a director I'd worked with before who was very respectful, and I was on the set every day. But there was still that sense of, it was like standing in the middle of a freeway with trucks coming at you every second. And so when you're in the theater, you feel that the emotional stakes are, in a way, much, much higher, and because everyone's just passionate about being there. But the other stakes, the other burdens that are placed on the work itself are lessened to a certain degree. It's a play, and you're not going to make a huge amount of money from a play, no matter what you do, so that everyone really wants to be there for the best reasons. So it was a wonderful transition.
Fabulous. So Julia, you find, at least in this profession, I find it's either feast or famine, and you are sitting at a mighty feast of 4 productions in New York.
Yeah.
Talk about that and how that's come to be.
Well, it was famine for a long, long time there. 2 of the plays that were produced this year, I wrote 7 and 8 years ago.
Yeah.
At school, at Juilliard actually, and they just sat there and they got lost in the workshopping. I mean, they were workshopped all over the country, and lots of dramaturgs and lots of talkbacks with audiences. And I always had Marsha Norman in my ear, though, saying, "Stop writing after 2 years. Don't touch it. You're a different person." So, yeah. So it was really hard, and it was also incredibly hard because, especially Tatiana was given awards and it was published, and I couldn't quite understand how that could be if it couldn't get produced. If it wasn't worthy of a production, why was it worthy of these other things? So I went through a really hard time where I stopped writing for 3 years, and I just felt like, what's the point? Really? I mean, why? I should write a novel. I should write something, but not a play. Yeah. And then my friend David Auburn, who wrote Proof, and who I was at school with, came over and basically told me, first of all, you have to get over the writer's block. So you got to do something for that. And he said, switch the gender, right from a male character's point of view, which I did. And I guess interestingly enough, it's my most personal play. I just sort of made myself male, I guess. But and he said, but on top of that, if you write this play, it will have a better chance of getting produced. And it's called Boy, and it was just the response was completely different. I mean, I think I am a much better writer, and people did know me already, so that helped. But yeah, so it was all very strange. It all kind of happened at the same time, but great. It's been great.
Fantastic. Nilo, how about you? You have an interesting journey with your production on Broadway.
But that's not my newest play. I'm working
No,
on
I
it.
know.
You want to talk about Anna? You want to talk about the newest?
Well, both.
I actually want to talk about, because Regina said something that is very curious, because Regina was working with Chekhov, and I'm working with Lorca in my new play. I was in Spain doing research on a play that had to do with Lorca's death. He was killed during the Civil War. And I wrote a play called Lorca in a Green Dress. And but when I was in Spain, I felt that I was not finished with him, that I felt like I had to explore more his life and certainly his death. So this new play of mine, which is called Beauty of the Father, it takes place in the centennial, 1998, and centennial of Lorca. And so it's as if Lorca was coming back to life as a ghost, but he's also dictating the action of the play, and the play is very much about impossible love, something that was very present in his life when he was alive. He just wasn't able to obtain love, and that's something that I'm exploring in my script. But I just did a production in Florida at the same theater that did Anna, that premiered Anna in the Tropics, and I've been writing this play for almost 2 years now. I actually was writing at the same time that I was writing Anna in the Tropics, and but for some reason I was also getting notes from a few dramaturgs and also from actors, and at one point the play started to escaped me in some ways. So after seeing the production in Florida, which I had some concerns with, and so I went back to the drawing board, actually, and took a lot of things out that I felt were going away from the story that the play wanted to tell. And I just did a reading, as a matter of fact, last week at New York Theater, at Manhattan Theater Club, and I was just so happy that I was able to get my hands on the play again. There were nights that I would just go to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning and wake up at 4 and do rewrites, and so it was like a fever just to get back in there and see what this play was really about. And so I did a reading, and I feel like my play is back, and thank God. So that's what I've been working on. And in terms of Anna in the Tropics, wow, everything's a surprise for me. I never knew that that little play that started a little theater in Miami, New Theater, was going to get a Pulitzer Prize. I never imagined that I was going to be on Broadway. And it's been a whirlwind for me this last year in terms of doing these kind of things with panel discussions or interviews. And it's quite overwhelming sometimes because it keeps me from writing, and I have 2 new plays circling me, and but I think a lot of people want to place a face with the name, and who's this guy who got the Pulitzer Prizes here. So I feel like I have to do this at this moment in time, but I can't wait to get back to the simple life, of being a writer. That's what I love, and that's what I enjoy the most, is when I'm immersed in the writing process.
It's a wide range of experiences. I was up at the O'Neill. I ran the O'Neill Playwrights Conference for the last 4 years. And to your point, Terrence, about dramaturgs, I entered into that process, which, by the way, the O'Neill claims as having brought the dramaturg to America, which I'm not so sure is a good thing. However, and when you trace back sort of the formal role that it's sort of evolved into over the last 25 years, it does seem to trace back to the O'Neill inviting dramaturgs to come in.
The notion of Eugene O'Neill and a dramaturg is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I mean, they would have just had a heart attack in one of his scripts.
And my thought is which I was very curious about, the role of the dramaturg, because of course I've worked with many writers, and one of the first things you hear is exactly how this discussion started off, was just real concern about yet another collaborator in the process that's actually quite intimate. It's a process of being extremely intimate, even within the individual, from a subconscious sort of instinctual thing that moves into a conscious state that ultimately gets shared with a group of people around a table, then ultimately with an audience. Yet to add another person in that mix seemed to be contradictory to being effective for the process to move along. However, when I was up at the O'Neill, every year we'd have 15 to 20 writers there, and the first year I said, so let's throw this discussion about the dramaturg on the table. We'd have these private meetings every week, and the minute I did that, it became a very long, heated discussion. And by the end of the discussion, I was trying to look for guidance from the writers. Do we have dramaturgs at this particular place or not? And it was a split. And then the following year, I thought, forget the conversation. I'm just going to see a show of hands. If you had a choice, who would have a dramaturg and who would not? And it was about a split. And it was very fascinating to me. So I ultimately kept the dramaturg there and tried to find very sensitive, sensible people for those roles, and really tried to talk about the writer taking the lead, the writer really leading the process, and the writer dictating what they need, and that each writer had the right to define that for themselves, and that no 2 writers, no 2 individuals necessarily approach work or themselves in the same way. But to throw this on the table a little bit, we've talked about your experience of being commissioned, and you've got 4 plays that are going on, and you've had a relationship with this theater, and you've all had relationships with theater, and ultimately I think that's what the theater boils down to. You talked about relationships Terrence, where, who are those first few people you send your play to? That to me is a dramaturg.
Those are my dramaturgs.
Exactly.
A good director, good actor is a dramaturg.
Yeah, it's a relationship.
And they're not strangers to me. A Nathan Lane or Zoe Caldwell, actors I've worked with repeatedly, or Joe Mantello or Frank Galati. These are wonderful. They do their job well, which makes them dramaturgs, but they don't tell you how to write it or...
They also have practical experience, which is what you're looking for. You're looking for someone who says, I don't know how to stage this, or that's not funny, or I can't play this, or hopefully I can. And that's really useful, as opposed to a more academic response to something.
Right. I think we've gotten to a point where we're so in our heads that we've lost touch with the visceral experience of, you had that experience up at Juilliard where you got to experience your play and sit in an audience and sit in a room with actors and a director and experience it versus coming at it with questions or, stuff that you're going to do naturally anyway. But I find often that the environment out there is one that writers are not entrusted with the assumption that they actually have a handle on what they're doing and a handle on a process. And in fact, I think we've created so many circumstances in the country where these plays are workshopped in week-long environments where a writer's the outsider to that environment, generally speaking, where you're invited to a theater to workshop your play, and it's a resident director, resident audience, resident artistic director, and all this input is coming in. And in fact, what you were saying, Nilo, where you begin, if you get enough of those bits of information and input begin to remove you from your instinctive sort of gut that really helps give birth to work.
They also, my experience has been that when you have a workshop that goes in front of an audience, because I had that with Tatiana at Actors Studio Free Theater, which was great, because if you workshop something and then you have the audience, to me that's the ultimate dramaturg. And when you look at the audience and they're fidgeting or they're not laughing, that's when you know, okay, I have to look at this piece. But it seems like dramaturgs sort of insert themselves in before we get a chance to have that ultimate thing. They come in with suggestions on day one before the actors find things, before we get a chance to, before the audience has a chance to respond. It just seems to me like maybe after we see the audience, after we've worked with the actors, when it's clear, this space right here, this part of the play, I have some questions I would like to ask you then, that would be more appropriate. Because,
Yeah, I agree with Julia. I also think that plays, the written word on the page is not really the play. The play comes to life, the canvas comes to life is when you actually see it on a space with an audience. So sometimes we're getting kind of responses, and it's too early in time to be getting these responses when you're just seeing the play being read out loud. I think that in the theater, we tell a play, the story of the play is told in many different ways, not just with the actual script. We have to remember that a play takes place in 3 dimensions now, and in this kind of so the visual aspects of it are also very important. The designers also tell a story through their design. The costume designer also tells a story. And these are all things that factor in the development of the play and sort of the play coming to life. And so I think for me ultimately is about the production. I learn from the production, and then I go back to the script, and certainly from the audience too, and then I go back and I do rewrites if I need to do rewrites, or if not, it's what it is. I also think that plays, like all works of art, need to have mystery, and there's some things that cannot be told. And I think art, to begin with, is all art is fragmentation. You know, and it's an abstraction. It is you abstract something from something else, and you kind of put it in a canvas, and so you should not be defined. I love to go to the museum and look at paintings, especially the modern painters, where sometimes they might have a face in the back where it's not really defined, and exactly it should be in a play. Sometimes I get notes from dramaturgs that tell me, oh, you should really explore this character's life a lot more. I said, no, this character is what it is, and that's it. So it's just like that painting, that face in that painting where it's just a little shady, and it's just not as defined as the others. So Anyhow, it's sort of like a labyrinth sometimes when it comes to this question of dramaturgs.
I don't like bad dramaturgs. I like good dramaturgs.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Dramaturgs add clarity, the voice of clarity, another eye. As you're in the creative process, you know, it is about just putting it out, seeing what it is, discovering it as you go along in the process. A good dramaturg will ask you questions. What are you trying to do in the scene? And you voice what I'm trying to do in the scene. And in hearing that, you go, oh, that's not what's happening here. That's a good dramaturg. I find them very valuable when they're very good.
Yeah.
So I
But I
like
think
your
that-
I'm
sorry.
like the idea you had of that the individual playwrights could define their dramaturg's responsibilities, because then if they could run errands, you know, or clean your apartment, they were a kind of
Get
personal
me some
shopper.
more pens. I need more
Exactly.
paper.
Though I did have a director who dealt beautifully and gracefully with a dramaturg who was over-eager, which I think is also because I think dramaturgs are often trained in drama schools and for a profession which is incredibly marginal. And so they really feel, okay, they'll give endless notes. And this director would appear very grateful, and he would say thank you, and he would fold up these multiple pages and put them in his pocket and never look at them again. And it would and the dramaturg never seemed to quite notice this. I think she felt it was somehow being integrated into the work, but it was a way of, I guess he was just being non-confrontational about it.
I think dramaturgs are often overeducated, and I think you get good in the theater by experience.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you really don't have to go to college to work. No one has ever asked me if I even went to college, let alone what degree I have, but someone's applying to get the job as receptionist at Manhattan Theater Club, and she has to present a, you know, curricula vitae, and, you know, what has she done? Did she graduated? But no one ever asks an actor or playwright, where did you go to school? You have a BA, MA. You get it through experience, and I think the questions you expect a dramaturg to ask, I expect my director to ask. I also think producers are... I want a producer who says, you know who's the set designer for this play or the director for this play? Because sometimes we get in a little box.
Sure.
I sometimes think we don't have enough real producers out there, and I don't mean the raising the money part of producing,
Right.
which I don't understand. It must be odious beyond description. But someone who really knows the right designer and director, or have a casting idea for a play of yours. You know, if he played that part and she did that, I think that's all important.
Yeah.
But I think theater is based on experience, and I think all of us have learned the most in previews and rehearsals, and I think what you said about a playwright taking responsibility for their script is very important. I think a real sign of a beginner is to blame the actors and the director and the set designer, and I think most of us now have learned you got to go home the first day if a scene isn't playing. At the first co-reading, it's your fault. Go home and work on it. Don't wait to the first preview. And but there's so, you know, the pool of talent in this city is still bigger there. And I always say to young people, just join a young theater company. You know, watch them grow. When I started working with Manhattan Theater Club, they were really small potatoes. Now they're producing Regina's play on Broadway, and
Yeah.
I don't know how many $1 million theater. You know, we used to do the plays up at a Polish social hall on 74th Street. And that's where a young person should get involved with his peers, her peers, one of the wonderful young companies off Broadway, and learn together this terribly difficult business of putting a play on.
Yeah. I think we lose sight of the importance of those relationships that are, you know, spawned in those kind of environments. And I think all of us, in all of the experiences we have, or wherever we are right now in our particular field, you know, we can look back and sort of bullet back to those relationships that were formed in those small environments, and you're working for free, or you're throwing a little money into the till to try to make it happen and make your own work happen. You know, we want to so shortcut it. You know, we want that. We want to identify that thing, and we want it right now.
I've read scripts by young writers. They're fairly, you know, you say, this is a good script. And they say, well, I only want it done on Broadway, and I want Pacino and De Niro and nobody else. And you say, get real. It's not
Yeah.
going to happen that
Yeah.
way. You should be happy if the Flea Theater wants to do it.
Right,
or
and
the
the-
Mint. And be proud they want to do it. Not, I don't mean be happy, but that's how it works.
Absolutely.
Look
and
at Nilo's play. Began in a small theater.
Exactly.
Masterclass began in Big Fork, Montana. Did you ever hear of Big Fork, Montana? I didn't know such a town of 400 people existed.
Yeah.
And that's where we want to give that play life.
And that all comes from these relationships that are formed. And, you know, getting back just to the dramaturg situation for 1 second, so that I don't want to appear to those out there who work very hard and who are good at what they do. You know, it depends how we define a dramaturg. You know, I think sometimes we point attack on a dramaturg as the person who's got their MFA from whatever program and now they're a dramaturg. To me, a dramaturg is defined by those relationships, you know, that are important to you. And I'm sure each of you could cite people in your lives that you would say are invaluable to the evolution of your work and a real sounding board for you. And if that's how we define a dramaturg, then I think there's room for that relationship. It's, I think, the sort of institutionalization of it that has cast a very negative shadow on that role. But back to the relationships that are important to all of us. You know, Paul, you've talked about having your relationship with New York Theater Workshop. You've had relationships with directors, I know, that are evolving even now. You work with several. And Nilo, you've talked about your relationship with the new theater down in Miami and so on, and Manhattan Theater Club, obviously, and also with the Goodman Theater. Talk about the importance of those relationships and what they've meant to you.
Well, I've had a multi-year relationship with Christopher Ashley, with the director who I treasure beyond all words, because I think finding a great director, finding your director, is like finding an ideal parent or a perfect therapist. It's the person who you can most importantly, in a way, fail in front of. Because I think this actually speaks to what we've been talking about, that you're at such an immensely vulnerable point when you are going into production, when you're working on a play, that you want to have someone you trust absolutely, someone who will tell you that stinks or that's funny or go in that direction, and who you can just go to that way and not worry about the opinion of the world quite yet. So that's why with Chris, I hope I never take him for granted, because every time I have a new play, that's where it goes first. And then beyond that, it's wonderful to have theaters that where they at least know your name, where they'll say, sure, show us whatever you're working on. Though it's funny, I was thinking back to when a play I wrote, Jeffrey, about 10 years ago, was a play that was turned down by every theater on the planet for various reasons. It was a comedy dealing with AIDS, and it was very gay, and it had so many things working against it. And I would even, along with the turn down, sometimes there'd be wonderful letters from the literary manager saying, oh, I love this, we'll never do this, or our audience will never stand for this. And at the time, I had a wonderful agent, a woman named Helen Merrill, who was sort of legendary. She died a few years back. She was a grand German woman who had been in this country for about 50 years and become more German with every moment. And she finally took the play and marched it over to the WPA Theater, which no longer exists. It was run by a terrific man named Kyle Rudnick, and said she was not leaving until he agreed to do the play. And luckily, he agreed pretty fast. So it was that. But the mere fact that there weren't so many levels of hierarchy and a board and, literary team, that he actually could just read it and say yes. And then suddenly we were underway, was so thrilling. And I was so grateful. And it was, I did other plays there, and it was still, oh my God, you felt also so protected and so treasured in the nicest possible ways. So it was, and I feel that way about the New York Theater Workshop as well. It's particularly dicey when you're dealing with comedy, because that's so subjective. And what I do love is watching that sometimes a lot of these not-for-profit theaters, which are very dedicated to doing difficult work and challenging work, that if you do a comedy, it turns everyone into a big laugh whore. That suddenly the people who are used to writing grants all day long and speaking, at graduate programs are suddenly saying, that's not landing. Or the audience wasn't going for that. Or, God, shouldn't you have a better button at the end of that scene? And you suddenly feel everyone's turned into, David Merrick. And that's, but that's fun, because suddenly you realize, oh, okay, we're all in the theater now. This is no longer, a dedicated intellectual forum. So I love having those people around me.
How about you, Joanne?
Relationships.
Yeah, what's evolved for you that's meaningful?
Well, I've worked with with this director, Joe Clarko. This will be our third time working together, and I just feel like I'm going to hold on to him for life, because we have that sort of perfect relationship where I can be really, really bad. I can write really, really bad stuff, and he has no qualms about telling me, and we're both screamers, and we don't hold it against each other. It's just perfect. So, and he did 2 children's shows for me, and both times we were casting very young actors who didn't have a lot of experience, and just sitting in the audition process with him and watching. Sometimes actors would come in and I'd be like, they're not good enough, and he'd be like, no, they are, trust me. And he was right twice. He delivered 2 great casts, great performances, and so I just believe in him. And then my other really important one is, and I've also worked with Will Pomerantz, who's amazing.
Yeah.
And but Primary Stages has been really good to me. I was in their writers group, and I wrote my play Boy in the group, and I had never been produced here at the time, and they were interested from the beginning and so supportive. And when South Coast Rep, who commissioned the play, let it go, when they passed on it, they just stepped up and said, we'll do it. And they've just stuck by me ever since, so it's been good.
Excellent. How about you?
Well, I love working at this little theater in Miami because I'm pretty much left on my own. There's not a dramaturg there, although I have a really wonderful relationship with a dramaturg that I want to talk about. So there, actually, when this theater, new theater, had commissioned me to write Out in the Tropics, and I was there in residency through a theater TCG grant, and they had announced the play before I finished writing it. It was pretty remarkable. But it was really great because it gave me the impetus to go in there and write the play. I basically wrote it in I think, less than 6 months. And I mean, of course, that first draft was full of mistakes, and to go back, I was terrified of showing it to the artistic director. But between the first draft and by the time we got into rehearsal, I was able to refine the play. And so it was really wonderful because I got to see the play up and see where the play was at, and then I went back and rewrote the play, and that's the play that I sent and I found out that I was nominated for a Pulitzer. I couldn't believe it. So I had done some rewriting and sent it to the Pulitzer people, and then I got the Pulitzer, and I did more rewrites on the play after that. You would think I would just leave it. I was a little bit afraid because I thought they were going to knock on my door and say, hey, that's not the play that we're giving you a award for. But I do have a wonderful relationship with a dramaturg at the McCarter Theater, Janice Perrin, and I actually dedicated the play Out in the Tropics to her because she did help me a lot in doing some rewriting on that play. And what's really wonderful with her is that I can really dialogue with her in where I'm at, and I could bounce off ideas from her. And so one of the things that I like about working, and the McCarter's a theater that I love to work in because I find that I need readings. I'm not just the writer who just writes a play and it's okay, it's fine. I need to hear it because I find that writing for the stage, that it has to be musical. The writing must be rhythmic, and so by hearing the play, I could see where my rhythms are in certain scenes, and which is also a problem in terms of rewriting, is if you start getting a lot of notes from people, and you start, I think rewriting is such a delicate thing because you start putting information into the play, it does interfere with your rhythm sometimes. So it's a tricky kind of balance here. I know I'm going all over the place, but more than anything, again, working with a McCarter, it's been really lovely for me because, again, I could see where I'm at in the development of my play through a series of readings that they provide for me. And I've had like 3 plays done there. So.
Excellent. Regina?
Yeah, I was thinking of Janice as well. She is one of the best dramaturgs in this country, I think. She's someone I can talk to and trust, and I know she'll just give it to me straight. With the Goodman Theater, I've worked with them for several years, and it is a place that was very valuable to me in terms of a place where I could feel I can fail. And I think that's really important, to be able to feel comfortable enough to fail, to say, okay, I'm going to take a risk here. And they take that risk with me and support me in that. Then you go somewhere unexpected with your writing. That's very important, to find a place that you can do that. I think a lot of theaters play it safe. They want that show that's going to be a hit, that's going to sell out. And I think particularly also with myself, if you're in a big institution, audience is in the back of people's heads when they think of choosing plays, when they choose black plays. Who's going to come see it? Maybe they're trying to develop their audience, so they want to open it up and bring black people in. But then sometimes I find that some theaters want you to shape your work for their audience. That becomes a huge problem then, because you can't work like that. You can't work like that at all. So to find a place where you feel like you can be true to your own voice and be able to take some risks, that's very important.
Terrence?
I think the notion of failing that the theater provides the playwright and the theater artists who work there, the opportunity to fail is very, very important if we're going to have art in theater. I think it's equally important that when the artist fails, they still embrace him. Yes. And I think a lot of us have felt when we have failed, we're no longer quite as welcome at the theater, which is very disappointing. The Globe produced all of Shakespeare's plays. He didn't have Pericles or Timon of Athens, and they said, oh, we'll go away for a while till you hit your stride again. Yeah. And then suddenly they got The Tempest and Winter's Tale, because they suffered through the plays that I don't think are maybe as great as some of the others. And theaters don't always do that. They say, you're here to fail, then you fail, and they're like, well, you failed. And I think really supporting an artist is, I think it's a tragedy that there was no one there for Tennessee Williams in the last years of his life, or Eugene O'Neill, though Eugene O'Neill did write some pretty great plays, no matter how badly he was treated by. I went to Columbia, and you couldn't even, drama stopped with, Thornton Wilder or somebody, but O'Neill they wouldn't even mention. And now the play of his was in print when he died. I didn't know that. I was shocked when I wanted to know more about this guy called O'Neill. All those plays are out of print, and terrible failures he had with his last two plays. And it's such a responsibility these institutions have to the artists to let them fail and mean it, and not just say it. And it's very tricky now, and I think what you said, as our institutions get bigger, they get more conservative, and they're so worried about broadening their subscriber base. And I don't think any of us particularly write for the subscriber base. People who know 2 years in advance, oh, I want to see that play May 11th, 2006. I don't know people like that. Most of my friends make a decision that night practically to go see a play. And so it's a more conservative audience you're writing for, and you become hostage. We've got 10 million subscribers, and next year we want 12 million. Well, I don't think that's how art happens. And finally, you have to talk about art when you talk about theater, or it's just commerce. And it's very hard to run a theater now. I know you have your own, and I know it's difficult, but it's a very fine line. But I think the most important thing, if we are to have artists in the theater, that they really feel supported, especially when they fail. To write a big hit play, and they say, we love you, bring us your next play. It's when you have a really big flop, and they say, we're going to do your next play. Yeah. That it matters to us.
Yeah.
End of speech.
Well, no, I couldn't agree more. Frankly, I founded a theater based on that.
And it's terrific what Signature does. I don't know if this audience knows your mandate, but it's wonderful.
It was founded out of those impulses of, one, feeling that the writing community was being discarded just one at a time through the hit and miss ethic that was prevalent and still is, where, you're only as good as your last play and maybe your last two. Maybe you're given one extra shot. And I found that not only that was the pretty hostile environment for writers, and I still think is relatively hostile, but also that they were just being lost and forgotten. You know, I think Tennessee Williams is a perfect example of somebody who deteriorated partly because there was nobody out there embracing him and his work. You know, it's really shocking.
The last play of Tennessee Williams, I forget the exact name of it. Do you know? Any of you know? It closed. It was supposed to close on a Saturday night after like a week.
Yeah.
And I said, I've got to see this. So I drove from the end of Long Island on a Thursday, and it had closed the day midweek, which is unheard of. And there was a note for refunds. Call the producer. And it was like, you know, apartment 12D. On, you know, they didn't have an office.
Yeah.
And the phone number, personal number, call this guy for a refund. And this is Tennessee Williams being produced out of somebody's apartment.
Yeah.
It was terrible, and there was no one there for him. And how can we let this happen to our artists?
Well, I also think we start thinking backward. You know, all good art evolves, and I totally agree with you that there is a sort of general sort of outside notion of how to approach product in the theater. You know, they approach it from, not that there's this universal they we always say, but there's, you know, we have to take responsibility as artists to listen to those voices that are within us, to surround us by the people who are those people that we trust and encourage us, and vice versa, and take responsibility for our role in it as well. Again, pointing to some discussions I had up at the O'Neill, we'd have these round table discussions. They used to have critiques after every reading, where the whole community would gather and talk about the work. And they went something like this: the first 5 minutes were, I loved it, you're great. And the next 5 was, you know, I didn't quite understand. And then the third was, and final segment was, and here's how you fix it. You know, there was this whole sense of stripping it down while it's still in its incubator and infancy. You know, pulling judgment out on something that really there's no business for. And I find it interesting that I think it's because we're dealing with the written word that most people feel they have some authority, because they write letters and they use language every day in their lives. I don't think it's something that's even conscious. I think it's just assumed in some level that, you know, we would never imagine telling a sculptor, you know, standing behind the sculptor and as they're working and presenting something to us, that I don't quite understand that that's a shoulder. You know, but we allow, there's a process that's allowed that sculptor picks a slab based on, you know, the idea, the amount of clay, cuts away and starts touching it. And it's almost the minute they start touching the thing, it's a process of the art informing the artist. And ultimately the art wins out if we're really listening. You know, but I don't think we afford our writers that opportunity. And when we do, when there are those relationships, as you've all described, whether it's with a director or a theater or whatever it might be, a dramaturg in your case, you know, then the work begins to thrive. The art begins to be born. And when you find those adventuresome producers out there, and there are some out there.
Well, I think it's very dangerous, this whole concept of understanding. I remember when I saw a Tarkovsky film, The Sacrifice, I didn't understand anything, but I loved it. And I went back to the theater 3 times, and still I didn't understand it, but I loved it. There was something, there was a certain kind of, I felt connected to what he was doing. I felt an emotional connection. The same thing happened to me when I saw Pasolini's film Salo. I was very young when I saw it. I was in my 20s. It was a very dark film. And I tell you, I went back in my 30s and saw the film again. I thought, my God, this is a master. It's a very, very dark film, but I thought, this is a masterpiece. The way he's told the story in a very elegant way, this really dark story about sadomasochism, excuse me, and the times of fascism in Italy. And, but I was not ready for it then. And just to say, well, I don't understand it, well, maybe it's me that doesn't understand it, but the work of art has a certain kind of wisdom and knowledge, and it should be what it is.
Yeah. I remember we did a season of a wonderful writer named Adrienne Kennedy, who I'm sure you all know.
Oh, yeah, of course.
An extraordinary writer, and I remember I had never seen anything of Adrienne's, and I had known the Owl Answers, and I started reading more of her work as we were considering a season. And I started reading it, and in several instances, I found myself in a situation where I wasn't following it, but by the end of the experience, I was deeply moved by it. And I just loved that contradiction.
Completely.
You know, it was completely taken away by something that was just greater than I could grab onto in that moment. And to see that work, again, speaking to the point about the work being heard and experienced in a three-dimensional way, the first time we put that work on its feet was extraordinary, to hear that language come alive.
Well, I'm drawn to Chekhov and Shakespeare over and over, and Hamlet I probably have memorized, but to say I understand Hamlet would be an absurd statement, or I understand the seagull. How can you understand these plays in all their complexity? They just draw us to them because they're so resonant.
Yes.
And, you know, you understand a polemic play with a, you know, bang point to it. And, but real art, I think, is much more mysterious and timeless
And thrilling.
and thrilling. And, yeah. But it's easy for a writer like Adrienne Kennedy to be dismissed as too difficult. Or,
Absolutely.
you know, but those plays, you never forget having seen one of her plays. And
Yeah.
I remember when they were brand new in the 60s, the world premiere of The Owl Answers.
Yeah.
And it was just remarkable. I mean, how can you forget having seen that play? But to say I understand it, you're not supposed to understand it, I
No.
don't think, Adrienne.
No.
Say, oh, here's what it means in one sentence. But
Yeah.
And then we get back to the dramaturg issue, people trying to maybe make a play mean something.
Yes.
What does Long Day's Journey mean?
Yes.
It's a great experience to sit there, to me, for those 3.5, 4 hours with that family.
Well, I think another problem is that they want it to mean something that they personally understand in their terms. And so it becomes, that's another thing with the talkbacks and the workshops and everything, is when everybody starts weighing in, you lose, if you're trying to draw a specific character, specific circumstances, it seems to me that the more perfectly it's drawn, or the more specifically it's drawn, the more the humanity, the common humanity becomes apparent. It's when you have too many people sort of rounding out all the edges, all of a sudden it doesn't really feel human anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, listen, we're going to come back in a minute. And when we come back, I'd love to talk a little bit about what I find very compelling is this notion of fear that drives all of us in our art and in our choices every day. And then what's our role and responsibility in the art itself? Where do we stand and take responsibility for the trends that happen and all the things we've talked about that are upsetting us? Where do we stand in that? And how do we participate in perpetuating circumstances that are not always helping the art? We'll be back in a few minutes after hearing from the American Theater Wing. Thanks.
I'm Howard Sherman, Executive Director of the American Theater Wing. This seminar, part of our ongoing series on CUNY TV, is only one way in which the Wing works to enhance the understanding of theater for students, for aspiring professionals, and for the general audience. As a not-for-profit organization with its roots going back almost 90 years, the Wing has long stood for education and excellence in theater. Our other programs include a video guide to careers in theater, available, as are many of these seminars, on our website, americantheaterwing.org. Our grant program, which provides funding to 50 of New York's institutional theater companies, and perhaps our best-known venture, the Antoinette Perry Tony Awards, created by the Wing in 1947 and now recognized as the pinnacle of achievement in Broadway theater. We're very proud of the work we do, and we're continually exploring ways in which the Wing can better serve and sustain the vitality of theater. And we're grateful for the support of our donors and members who make our work possible. And now, back to our discussion.
And we're back. We're going to continue our discussion with our panel of playwrights. Just before the break, we were talking, or I introduced the idea of talking about fear and our responsibility within the field to deal with some of these issues that are confronting both our writers and the field at large. So I'd like to open up with talking about the fear sort of quotient a bit. I think what's been fascinating to me and rather consistent with every artist I've ever worked with, and every writer in particular, is that fear within all of us is a real motivator. It drives us, it feeds the art, and I mean, I'm talking about the healthy kind of fear, the stuff you're just afraid of delving into or confronting, or you're surprised. You talked earlier, Regina, about surprising yourself in your writing and how exhilarating that is, and part of that, I think, comes out of confronting a fear within us. When we were doing the Arthur Miller season, I remember at the opening of a brand new play of his, we were sitting out in the lobby as the audience was taking the play in, and he was just sitting out there sort of confounded and said, you know, where do these people come from? Well, why are they here? You know, and part of that was speaking to just a part of himself that was afraid of what he might confront through that process. And I found it extremely liberating. So I'd just love for us to talk about that a little bit. Why don't we start with you again, Paul?
Well, I still do have this fear when I'm very early in the playwriting process, that when I do a first draft, that I used to think, oh my God, every line should be perfect before you continue on to the next perfect line. And so when I realized that would mean I would write one play every 3,000 years, so I would just sort of spew out a first draft, just get it on the page, just get it over with, and then I would have this terror that I would be killed that night in a car accident. And people would find this first draft and imagine that I thought it was good. Then it finally occurred to me, if that should happen, I would be dead, so why am I worried? So that it was that, you know, that sort of fear of something less than perfection. And then I met another playwright who was actually not really a very good playwright, but one of the most confident human beings I've ever met. And she was so sure of her own genius that at the end of each day of writing, she would put the pages she'd worked on in the freezer. So in case her apartment caught on fire, they would be saved. Or at least chilled.
Wow.
I thought, I wished I had that sort of regard for my work and my appliances, but it was... But it was that kind of thing where you just have to get over it, because you think it's, you know, that fear can so continue throughout the whole writing and production process of, oh, it's never going to be good enough. People are going to hate it. They're going to hate me. They're going to, you know, all of that. And you just, eventually you say, all of that is all going to happen. So just do it.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Julia? Do you?
Well, I think when you were talking about Arthur Miller, I mean, I don't want to compare myself to him, but I always feel a little bit like, what's so special about me? Like, why would they want to hear exactly what I have to say about anything? But then I think, oh, well, maybe I just, you know, say it a little bit better, write it a little bit better. I don't know, but it's mostly for me, it's a fear of not being good. It's a fear of sort of being exposed as not what maybe I crack myself up to be, kind of. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For me, fear has to do with facing the blank page. Is that not knowing what I'm going to write about? Because I usually do not know what I'm writing about. I usually start with something. It could be just a face, a character. It could be a name. It could be some particular kind of behavior that I'm interested in exploring. So I never know what the play is going to be about, and just facing that blank page, and then thinking to myself, like, how did I write the last play, and how did it happen? You know, so I think that's fear for me more than anything, and I think it's a good thing. I think fear is important because. And I also, when I see actors, you know, that those moments before going on stage, how nervous they get, I think it's important because something else kicks in, whether it's adrenaline or it keeps you human too. And I think that we need to be in touch with the human in us when we're dealing with the arts. And so it's a good check and balance. Although I also think that fear can also keep us from working and from challenging ourselves too. So I think it's a double-edged knife. But I think what we shouldn't fear is fear itself. What did I say?
That's a good phrase.
Well said. I like that.
Keep that.
Regina, how about you?
I've been living daily with fear and pain for the last 2 weeks. I'm in previews right now.
Yeah.
And I haven't slept in 2 weeks. For me to even function at all is really hard. To just get up and put on your clothes is facing fear every day. Birthing a new project, and this is my first time on Broadway. I was going, okay, okay. But actually, I'm like, oh God. It's been a really very painful, difficult, and I hate admitting fear, but absolutely I'm scared to death. And that is the process. I think you grow from it, you learn from it, but this has probably been one of the most difficult experiences I've ever had. And you go, well, okay, you'll live through it, and hopefully someone will produce you again. And I have faith in that. But this process is very hard. It's very hard. And I feel like, I'm just being very honest, I feel like the stakes are much higher than I've ever faced before. And the thing, though, is that I have faith in the process. I have faith in the people that I work with, and that gets me through the day. Talk to me after we open, but that's how I feel at this moment.
Terrence?
Well, I want to thank Paul and Julia for telling me about a fear I wasn't aware of, but now, of course, I have it. What is the audience doing here? Why should they come see a play of mine? Never occurred to me to have that fear, so thank you for the play opening in a week tonight.
Our pleasure.
Oh, God, why did you do that? I never knew I had that fear. I've caught it, it's like the flu. My own personal fear is always a new one. My fears have shifted over the years as I've gotten older. Not wiser, but older. But I think the fear now is after the debacle, whatever you want to call it, of Corpus Christi, which was my last produced play in New York City. I became very fearful as I was writing the new play called Dedication. I better not say this. I better not do that. I'll get in trouble again. Manhattan Theater Club will be mad at me. The Catholic Church will be. Someone will be mad at me.
Yeah.
And those voices just go. Take the calmer route. Don't go there. And then you think, oh, I'm going to just take the other route just to say, not help. That's not art either. Yeah. You know, you got to be level-headed. And that scared me that I was going to, you think Corpus Christi upset you? Where do you see this one? Yeah. And that's not good writing out of hostility. So it really, I never felt so that you can, I guess, get into trouble as a writer. I'd never... You know, people like plays, not like plays, but this was different.
Yeah.
And when you have death threats on your life, you really can get in big trouble. Yeah. And it's not fun. And I never saw that play until I saw it in just a production in Chicago about 2 years ago. They were doing it, and I bought a ticket. They didn't know I was there, and it was so nice to see my play without going through a metal detector and dogs barking at you and all that, and bullhorns. And I like my own play actually, where I'd never seen it in New York. So that's a fear. To stay true to yourself, and I think that, you know, it's a fear of people aren't going to like me, and I don't think an artist can worry about that. And I think we've all written plays that have upset people, and that's another function of art too, or challenge people certainly, and not be complacent. But that's a quiet fear. It's not like the fear you talked about, which I will experience tonight, thank you. Why are these people here? I'll interview them. But I did have a man come up to me the other night, and he said, I'm a middle-class man from New Jersey, and I think your language was unnecessarily raw. And I said, well, I'm sorry, thank you for that. And this woman kept saying, I'm his wife, I loved it, don't stop. But if you start thinking that, is this raw or not? It's what you felt when you wrote it. And we were talking in the green room. A big comment we all get is, when it's open to the audience, you're such nice people. Why do you have to use vulgarities in your writing? And it's just so... Can't believe people even ask you that. Don't they list? Don't they ride the subway? Don't they live in New York City? Yeah. And that's not vulgarity. The four-letter word is not vulgarity. What's going on in the world is vulgarity. So I think that's my biggest fear, that this play will get done if I fix it that way. And it's tempting. And as you say, the stakes on Broadway, don't they seem higher, Paul? You've done both.
Oh, sure, because it's so public. And because I had an experience on a play called I Hate Hamlet that had, for anyone who has sort of a tabloid memory, it starred an English actor who was deeply mad and just alcoholic at an Olympian level. And he was playing the ghost of John Barrymore. And the first act ended with a climactic on-stage duel between Nicol and the young actor Evan Handler. And Nicol didn't care for Evan or anyone else on the planet. And one night during the duel, actually stabbed Evan and drew blood. And Evan, God bless him, who was an absolute saint, left the stage at intermission and the production. And so the next morning, I went downstairs, and it was the full front page of the New York Post was a still of the duel with the huge headline, "I Hit Hamlet." And the little head was, "Star swats actor on the butt." Just sort of New York Post poetry. And this then continued, and there were TV crews from all over the world at the theater. It just became this sort of grand adventure. And it was such a bizarre event and people would come up to me and say, "Oh, Paul, this will be such a great chapter for your memoirs." Like, lucky me. And I thought that what they told people, in the lifeboats on the Titanic. But it was suddenly, it was just madness, and it was being played out in front of everybody. So when you're on Broadway, and I think any form of theater, you've got an audience, God willing, so that you're putting yourself on display, and that's a risk that, nobody put a gun to your head and said you could do that. You had to do that, so it comes with the territory. But it's very unnerving, and it's funny. I think people sometimes imagine that because the actors are on stage, they're the most exposed. And yes, in a sense they are, but I think the trembling playwright in the back of the theater is having maybe even a far larger breakdown, because you're feeling the waves of response, lack thereof, satisfaction, praise, what of the future, and it's very daunting. But on the other hand, it's the exhilaration, and it's also why you don't do a play every day, because you collapse. But and when things go well, there's no greater high. It's why theater will never die, because you only get that level of ecstasy from a live audience. When the response is going well, when it shoots the actors that much higher, there's nothing like it on earth. So that's why you put up with all the rest of it.
Yeah. Well, I feel much better. I mean, it is, this past week has been like, oh my God, hell. When you have like 100 people walk out, you're going, oh my God. But the people who stay, they're really wanting to stay. So that's good. And less people are walking out, and it is getting...
There's nothing like having someone...
nothing like that.
See people putting on their coats at intermission, and it's not going to have a cigarette. They're heading for the subway. Or in the men's room, when you're standing at the urinal at intermission, the guy next to you says, "Isn't this the worst play you've ever seen?" No, you don't pee, and your room's a second. It's horrible.
No, but you have to be careful, because you can misread even the most violent audience reaction. Because last week during previews, there was a woman who, sitting, of course, dead center in the front row, who in the second scene of Valhalla, got up, made her way through all the other people, ran to the back of the house, went into the lobby, and vomited. Oh. And I thought, oh my God, when did I do that? And then, God bless her, she came back. And she actually, during the course of that evening, she left 2 more times to throw up. But I loved her for coming back.
Back?
I thought if I was that sick, I'd just go home.
She wanted to
I
see
thought
your
she
play.
wanted to see how it ended.
did.
So I thought, oh, I could have taken this as my first review.
Yeah.
But luckily, she she was very kind. So I think you have to. The live event can go all sorts of ways.
We don't need the critics really to tell us how our plays are going. The audience really lets you know.
Mm-hmm.
And at a
day.
certain point, yes, that's true. And at a certain point, if you are doing something that is outside of the boundaries of what people are expecting, then you have to stand behind the work and
Yes.
say, "This is the work. I'm
I
very
wanna do
proud
it."
of it," and that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you all talking about this because I think it's so important. I think people assume somehow, because you're sitting in these chairs and talking about work that's important to you, that somehow you know how to do it, and somehow you don't have fear. But I think one of the most liberating things you can offer, not only this audience but anyone viewing, is to in fact expose that fear and expose that it is new every time. It is new every time. You hit that blank page every time, whether you've been writing for 40 years or for 5 years. It's the same challenge. Your experiences inform it, but it's still, as you said, Terrence, you may be older, but you're not any wiser, so to speak. But in fact, you are. But
If there were formula writing a successful play, there would be so many successful
yeah,
plays.
exactly.
And what do you think the rate is of successful plays? 1 in a couple of hundred, I would think.
Yeah, successful anything. I think in any
well,
art
let's
form.
just stick with plays. I mean,
Exactly.
it's just very hard.
Yeah.
I say it's like trying to grow an orchid in Alaska for a play to blossom. There's so many things that can go wrong from the time we finish our scripts to, I think, as Nilo said, about sets, costumes. It's all part of telling the story. And especially a new work. Everyone has an idea now of what our old plays should be like.
Yeah.
But when our new plays, we're as good as the actors, designers, directors, people we're working with, because no one knows what Drowning Crow is supposed to be yet. There's no template for that play yet in New York City, certainly. And then next, it'll be another production of it, and there's another way to do it. But it's very hard, and also off Broadway, don't you think we work every bit as hard? Didn't you work as hard in your little theater in Miami as you did at the Plymouth?
Oh,
The
completely.
Royale here, yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's not.
Doesn't
People
change,
think
yeah.
the pressure is greater, but we work just as hard
Absolutely.
off Broadway to be good, and the actors work as hard. Everyone does.
Yeah. There were a few comments from the audience during our break, and several of them sort of jumping off of the Corpus Christi thing. We talked about censorship in terms of whether it's self-imposed or in other ways. Have any of you, I know, Terrence, you just talked a bit about Corpus Christi, but have any of you felt that within yourself, censoring yourself as you write, or have in fact felt it from outside sources and forces as well?
I think one of the wonderful things about the theater is that alone among mediums, there can be less censorship because the writers have far more legal controls over it. The Dramatists Guild contract means that no one can change a word of your work without your permission. So that at least at that level, also I think because the economics of theater are far more limited than in film and larger mediums, it does give you more freedom. And also because the audience can be more sophisticated if they've made a habit of going to the theater. I think that's what's one of the things that's so exciting and unique about theater is that the material can be far more challenging, far more provocative, far more delightfully obscene than in any other medium where you have ratings and you have PG whatevers. That theater, thank God, doesn't come with those restrictions. But self-censorship is something else. Well, and Terrence, I thought, put it beautifully, where you wonder sometimes, are you deliberately censoring yourself, or are you deliberately trying to be outrageous for its own sake, which can be another kind of trap? So it's interesting, and that's also something the audience will tell you, is what lines they will and will not cross. And sometimes that becomes the point, like, no, push them. Say, no, I don't care if this is going to upset you. Although I did remember, I think you were saying about language, that my aunt, beloved aunt, told me that same criticism at her husband's funeral. He was lying in a coffin a few feet away, and she said, "Paul, you know, your uncle always loved you, but he didn't know why you had to use that language." I thought, at his funeral? So that's the kind of thing where it's amazing that people still come up with that in an age of you know, David Mamet, of people who, you know, for years now have been saying every possible word. So, yeah, I think self-censorship is probably the greatest danger.
Well, I wrote a play, the Tatiana play, that requires the nudity of a 12-year-old girl. I mean, it has to happen. It is really the turning point for the whole play. And that was interestingly the play that I think brought me to the attention of a lot of theaters, but I was also told point blank that it would never be produced. And they were wrong. It is being produced. And it was also interesting to me that when it was read, the audience had no problem with it. Now, granted, they weren't seeing it, but they had no problem with it at all, the subject matter at all. But the artistic directors were afraid of it. So I did go through some, you know, I did try to steer myself into a little bit more of a commercial vein to start getting myself produced, and it didn't work. You know, ultimately, Tatiana went up on its own, and, you know, so, hopefully I'm going to put those ideas aside.
How about you, Nilo?
Well, I'm thinking a lot about it as my colleagues are speaking, and I think that there's always a level of censorship all around you, and because some people are going to like your work, some people are not going to like it.
Sure.
But I don't think about those things. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I love about I love doing my work as a writer, but I also like teaching. And I tell you why I like teaching, because one of the things that I like about being in a classroom is that I'm with a group of young people who are willing to take chances, who they don't know their craft well enough yet, but they're courageous and they want to experiment. They want to try new things. They want to break away from like formulas, and I find that keeps me on my toes too as a writer. Keeps me fresh and keeps me being courageous and, you know, tackling the next play and maybe writing it in a completely different way. And so I don't know. I mean, something that I try to do for myself is to combine the time that I spend alone as a writer, and I'm certainly getting inspired by seeing other plays, but also getting inspired by the new generation. What are their concerns? And again, that courage, which I think that has to be so alive in all of us, in the artists, because that's what art is all about, is being courageous. It's interesting because a gentleman just decided, a gentleman in Spain is translating my play, believe it or not, from the English to the Spanish. I could have done it, but I'm very busy these days. And I met with this gentleman in London, and he said that he had concerns I think he feared the language, because the language in my play is, Anna in the Tropics, it's lyrical. And I faced him and I said, I've translated Lorca many times, and a lot of people, I've seen the translations of Lorca, and a lot of people don't trust his language. And I said, you know, be courageous. This is what the art is all about. You know, face the poetry and go with it and run with it. That's what this play is all about. Anyhow, so maybe that's a form of censorship in some ways too. I try. I mean, I'm interested in beauty. I'm interested in you know. I find that sometimes I got momentary comments from people like saying, "Well, people don't speak that way," and I said, "Well, I'm certainly not interested in having the kind of language that one hears in a bodega, in a grocery store, because to me that's not art. I find that that we're writing for the stage, and when one is writing for the stage, you know, the language. I'm interested in beauty, you know, and I think that to have beauty on the stage is extremely. You have to be courageous.
What do you bet, Gina?
Yeah, censorship. Yeah.
What do you, when you're watching 100 people walk out of your play, does a part of you want to go? Does a part of you stand up and begin to try to censor yourself on that?
No.
Good.
I mean, you can't.
Good.
You
Yeah.
just face it.
Yeah.
And stand behind it. You face it.
Well, we have a few minutes left, and you know, we've talked about a lot of things about the craft and about the environment out there. You know, what's our role in this? How do, you know, when we talk about, you know, there's too many workshops, or, you know, I need this or I need that. You know, you talked about the Dramatists Guild you know, it has a provision in there that says you get the final word. You get the final word on casting. You get the final word on it, every word being as is, and ultimately whether or not a production is done. Do we need to say no more to production? Do the young person who is being thrusted into a situation where it's an opportunity, but it comes with a certain amount of baggage? Is that something we got to take on more to change the environment out there? Or what can we do to embrace the environment and make it a better place for your fellow writers as well as yourselves? Let me start with you, Terrence. If you have any
I
thoughts
think
on that.
write more plays, keep writing. It's very easy. Paul said, you know, you can't write a play every day or have one produced. It's too emotionally draining. You have to go out and have a life. I think you got to get really away from the theater sometimes. It can get very insulated. But we've got to keep writing plays. And I think, as Nilo said very wisely, courage is a great part of this. It's a great act of will to assemble people, sit in a room, put the lights down, and they go up on one end of it, and tell them a story. Do you think we can hold their interests? That takes courage, I think. And you just, you know, I wrote a play about Maria Callas, and as someone once said about her, she didn't lose her voice, she lost her courage. And I knew exactly what they meant, the will to go out there and say, I can hit that high C, and she lost that. And I've seen actors lose their nerve, and I've seen writers lose their nerve. And that's important. That's very hard to talk about publicly. It's a very private thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important. I'm so glad we acknowledged it today. I think being an artist is a very courageous thing to be. But I think the main thing we do is write our plays. And I do believe if you write a good play, it will be done. It may not be done on Broadway with Nathan Lane and, you know, Madonna, but it will be done. And that's the important thing. And all of us have plays that have begun so modestly, and because they had some quality and reached other people, they were eventually produced in New York, and people have seen them, I hope, and care about them enough to invite us to be on this panel.
Yeah.
So you got to remember that we have to do the work first. You can't. I'm going to write this great play for you. You got to write the play.
Yeah.
You know, that's number one. So I believe that very strongly. That's the main thing we do. I think working with younger people, getting them interested in the theater, the possibilities of theater. When you said what a heady art form it is, the intoxication that happens between a live play and an audience does not happen at Lord of the Rings. I mean, I loved it, but it's not the same thing as when you're seeing the show that's really cooking or they're really laughing at like one of Paul's comedies. And that's wonderful, and that's why you do it. And I think working in the theater is its own reward. And anyone who goes into the theater to get rich is very, very stupid. You do it to have a great life, and as writers, we do have wonderful lives. And as Paul said about the Drama Guild, no one can make us change our plays. The buck stops with the five of us sitting up here.
Well, I'm being flagged that time is very short.
sorry,
I
I
want
spoke
to thank you for that, because I think it's a wonderful place to leave this discussion. And I want to thank each of you for your courage. One, to sit on this panel, but most importantly for the work that you offer us every day. You help illuminate things in ourselves that move us and take us to places that just we are privileged to go. So thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today.
That's the excitement that we talk about when you go into the theater. That's unlike anything else. The rustle of the program and the waiting for either the first chord of the orchestra or the curtain to go up. There is that maybe this time, and even if it isn't this time, there is still something that is very magical and very wonderful about live professional theater.